Rishi Sunak says he was handed the worst hospital pass for any incoming Prime Minister. But does that bear out in fact? Today we reveal the results of our Sun mega poll. The Tories are trailing Labour by 21 points in our Savanta super survey. The PM is caught in a pincer movement. Reform on the right, Labour to the left. Polling guru Sir John Curtis says there's a 99% chance Sir Keir Starmer is the next Prime Minister. But Sunak insists there's still hope. Tonight the Sun takes the temperature of the nation. Is all hope lost? And who's to blame for the mess? We find out. This is Never Mind the Ballots. Now, joining me to discuss the Sun's mega poll is Chris Hopkins from Savanta and the Sun's political correspondents Martina Bett and Sophia Slay. Chris, Sir John Curtis, a different polling guru to yourself, says 99% chance Keir Starmer is the next Prime Minister. Do you agree?
I mean, it's nice to be called a polling guru. I think that might be the first time. I'm not sure I'd put a percentage chance on it quite like that. I think ultimately, if we want to look at that, probably our betting markets, frankly, are the best place to go. But time's running out for the government to turn this round. And I think what we're showing in our most recent polling is just an increased Labour lead.
So let's have a look at that Labour lead. 21 points, Labour on 45, Conservatives on 24, Reform on 12, Lib Dems on 10. Now, that Reform number is a little bit lower than some other pollsters. Is that a glimmer of hope or is it a different methodology? Different
methodology, frankly. We don't include Reform in our initial prompt like a lot of the pollsters that are showing them on 15, 16. I think there's been a poll out today. I mean, that's a House decision, one that we might review. But at the minute, Reform still feels like a bit of an enigma to us, particularly at Savanta. But I think to pollsters in general, we just haven't seen the electoral evidence that they're on 12% or on 15%. Maybe the local elections will change that. But at the minute, they are feeling like a bit of a mixed bag for pollsters, and we're not quite sure how to treat them.
One thing is clear and stark is that Labour lead. Do you think that's sort of unassailable now? Have you ever seen a lead like that be overcome in an election?
Yeah, I mean, it's feeling unassailable. I think that's really points to some of those comments that John Curtis made. I think, again, at Savanta, we've tended to be on the smaller side of Labour leads, again, possibly down to some slight methodological differences with other pollsters. But what we have shown over the last couple of weeks is increasingly large Labour leads. I think this is our largest one since September 23. We've come off the back of a 20-point lead. That was our largest one since September. 18 points, that was our largest one since September. So really, we're only moving in one direction, and that direction at the minute is just increasingly bleak for the government.
So last summer, don't correct me if I'm wrong, it looked like Rishi Sunak was going in the right direction. The Tories were nudging back up towards the 30 points in the polls, putting them perhaps in play for the next election. And now with that, now Rishi Sunak's back down to sort of levels not seen since Liz Truss, and we all know how that ended. Yeah, he says, he inherited this hospital pass. Does that bear out in the data?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you'd have asked me that a few months ago, I would have probably agreed. And I think that it was fair to say a couple of months ago that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss were more to blame for the Tories' current predicament than Rishi Sunak was. I don't think that's the case anymore. At least I don't believe that Rishi Sunak can completely absolve himself of blame anymore.
Because this is on his watch, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. He's had plenty of time now, frankly. And I think that what's really kind of coming through in some of the data is that the Conservatives are in this predicament because they have a record of not delivering on things, whether that's Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges, including Rwanda and stopping the boats.
Yeah.
But no matter what the rhetoric, no matter what some of the things that he says, which should in theory appeal to his voters, if he's being seen to not be acting on any of them, then both those voters that agree with his immigration stance aren't going to like it, and those that disagree with his immigration stance definitely aren't going to like it.
So making promises he hasn't delivered has actually hurt him?
I think that's really hurt him particularly.
If we drill down into the data a little bit, though, it does say that Rishi Sunak is, is he mostly to blame for the current state of the party? 35%, that's quite a big chunk. But 50% say previous leaders are mostly to blame. So there is a little bit of fairness in that, hospital pass argument, isn't there?
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, it's all well and good inheriting a hospital pass, but it's what you do with it ultimately. Yeah. And I think, when there was optimism when Rishi Sunak came to power, I think, we did the focus group the week that he became Prime Minister of Conservative switches, Conservative 29 switches, and they weren't convinced that he was necessarily going to be the person to win their vote back, but they did feel at least a bit sorry for him. They felt that he was the best person to manage the Conservatives into this next election. I don't think they'd say the same thing anymore.
52% say that he's been let down by others in his party. That's, presumably that's the squabbling Tory tribes, right?
Yeah, and probably also previous leaders. I think we have to look back over the course of the last 4 years to see that it was Partygate that really started to move things, and then the Labour lead went astronomical during the Truss era.
Do you think that any Tory Prime Minister, really, the scale and size of that 2019 coalition, a fairly phenomenal group of people from the Red Wall to seats in the South, Brexit and Corbyn, that combination, could any leader really hold this together?
I think it's increasingly unlikely that any leader could. I think the Conservative brand really now is through the floor, and it would be incredibly difficult for any leader to come and take that back. I think that it's incredibly challenging for Rishi Sunak to kind of thread this impossible needle where they're bleeding votes to the left in the Labour Party and the right in Reform. So it's hard to know what strategy to put into play to win one of those voter sets back, because whichever one you do win back, you're going to alienate maybe more to the other side.
I think the stat that will send a chill down the spine of Downing Street strategists for me is 8 out of 10 voters, 82%, say they're unlikely to change their mind. Now, is that a little bit of voter shyness, or is that they are so angry with the Tories it doesn't matter, it's game over? Or do you think people say they won't change their mind, but then they do?
Yeah, look, the sensible kind of political scientist pollster hat on me will say people are very bad predictors of their own behaviour. Changing your mind is socially undesirable. So there's going to be a bit of social desirability bias in there. There's going to be a little bit of people just not really understanding their propensity to change their mind. But I think it does still speak to the doldrums that the Conservatives are in. I think it speaks to the fact that they may have lent the Conservatives their vote in 2019, but they're unlikely to now win it back. And I think we've seen that in some other stats that imply that just sort of a very small percentage of those that have abandoned the Tories think that they might possibly even vote for them at this next election.
Keir Starmer, just quickly, Keir Starmer head-to-head with Rishi Sunak is 9 points clear, 38 to 29. I can remember polls not that long ago that were showing those two neck and neck, with don't know being a big thing. Is that moving away from the Prime Minister in a big way now?
I think we've seen a relatively stable kind of 9 to 12 point lead for Keir Starmer for quite a while. We've shown consistent Starmer leads since May, basically. I don't think Sunak has overtaken Starmer since May 23. Those leads started off at like 2 points, 3 points, 4 points, and now they're at 9, 12, 10 consistently. It appears relatively irreversible. Things can change, campaigns can change things. We saw that in 2017. But at the minute, polling is ultimately a nowcast, and yeah, this definitely implies that there'd be a Tory wipeout.
Let's remind us of those top lines of the voting intention. Labour 45%, Conservative 24%, Lib Dems 10%, Green 3%. Not a great look for the government, is it, Martina?
No, definitely not. But if I may, Chris, I just wanted to ask you this that I picked out. So you analysed Labour switches, and apparently 6 in 10, so 60% say it's a vote for Labour rather than against the Conservatives. And of course, throughout the last few months, we heard that actually there's not enough love for Labour out there. But this shows a different picture.
Yeah, I mean, I've found this stat probably if I was to pick one stat out of this that I found the most surprising, I think this might be it. And I think that ties into this narrative that there is a little bit of ambivalence or maybe indifference towards the Labour Party. That said, there's a lot of vitriol and anger towards the Conservative Party, and I think that ultimately contributes to that figure. I do think it's interesting that while 6 in 10 con to Labour switchers say that it's a vote for Labour, 86% of con to Reform voters say it's a vote for Reform. So perhaps there is still some more anti-Conservative rather than pro-Challenger sentiment among those Labour switchers than Reform switchers, but still, I think that stat is still pretty telling.
Sophia, I mean, does this chime with what you're hearing from MPs? And has reality sunk in yet for large parts of the Conservative Party? This poll tonight shows that Labour are ahead on tax, on small boats, on immigration. Are MPs aware of quite how bad this is looking?
Oh, I don't think they are, to be totally honest with you. And I think this poll will actually shock quite a few of them. I mean, they know it's bad. The thing they keep saying to me is, Sophia, there's lots of undecided voters out there. But this poll has basically set fire to all of that. Their strategy, relying on undecided, says, this has just set fire to all
Chris,
of that.
is that in that crucial 2019 Tory cohort, the people that gave Boris Johnson that massive majority, is there any, Sophia, right? Is there any, well, the MPs, right, sorry, is there any room for movement there?
Look, things can change, but I think there will need to be action from the government to enable that change rather than just relying on a increasingly small, frankly, bunch of voters that might have not quite made their mind up yet, or might have not quite decided that the Conservative Party are completely not for them. I think that some of those that have switched maybe could go back, contrary to perhaps to some of this, if they see some action. But that is the biggest if in British politics at the minute, frankly, and it seems increasingly unlikely.
And they might not go back in time for this election. It might be they're not completely ruling out going back to the Tory party one day, but they're going to sit this one out, or they're going to actively vote against.
Yeah, I mean, that's what our polling shows. I think it's 8% of those that did vote Conservative at the last election and now have a different voting intention or are undecided say that they might still vote Conservative at the next election. Half of them say that they might vote Conservative at some election, but not this one. Yeah. You know, all is not lost for the Conservative Party, but I still, like, long term that is, but I still think that of that proportion that say they might come back eventually, they're very split between those that are more inclined to go to the Labour Party and more inclined to go to Reform. Therefore, it's really difficult to have one unified strategy to bring that whole group back.
And is that going to hurt? Is that going to hurt Keir Starmer? Is that the fact that he's not winning over those Reform votes and it's slightly split that some are going to Labour, sure, but not all of them. Some of them are going to Reform. Is that going to hurt Keir Starmer, or is that just going to hurt the Tories and send him on his way with an even bigger majority?
You know, I think it's wrong to assume that every single Reform voter is just a Tory in disguise, frankly, and if Reform didn't stand in a seat, that would just automatically gift the Conservatives those votes. But I think ultimately Reform are a massive help if these numbers play out to Keir Starmer, because some of those Labour con marginals, which perhaps aren't in play, if Reform take a massive chunk of that Conservative vote, then maybe they are more in play for the Labour Party, and that is probably what some seat modellers would perhaps think is making these majorities that some people are almost predicting seem even larger, in the 200 seat mark maybe.
Martin, the Easter breakers couldn't come soon enough for Downing Street. The MPs are now scattered back across the country. They're not in the corridors of power and in the bars lurking around plotting. But what do you think is going to happen, if this poll plays out in terms of the local elections? How bad do you think it could get for the Prime Minister in the immediate aftermath?
I think quite bad. I mean, we know that there are a few people that are actively trying to depose the Prime Minister. Obviously, maybe not as many as some people thought, but
they're very vocal journalists are the one that do those.
Exactly, and there's not love for the Prime Minister out there in the Conservative Party. People say, we heard from Ben Wallace saying, "Let's march towards the guns." I mean, it's not great. It's not a great look. Yeah. So there's not love for Rishi Sunak out there in the Conservative Party. Things could get worse for him. And as Chris said, the biggest problem is that he's not delivered on those pledges that he made last year.
Savanta, do you think he's, May danger zone? Do you think he could just, we've been seeing lots of speculation, not least started by me in my column last week, that if it looking really bad for the locals, he could call the election in June rather than try and wait to October. What are you picking up on that?
I think that is an option, but I mean, a lot of MPs are aware that should they try and topple Rishi Sunak, it will look completely bonkers to voters. Yeah. How many prime ministers we had in the last 4 or 5 years? I think the cut through on that will be astronomical and embarrassing, actually, to the ordinary voter.
Is that right, Chris? Things could get worse, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I made a prediction around conference season last year that I didn't think Rishi Sunak would necessarily lead the Conservatives at the next election. I think that's more down to Conservative MPs and their tendencies rather than whether they think it's a wise electoral strategy. I don't think that voters would reward a fourth Conservative Prime Minister in 4 years. I think it would make things even worse. But I understand this tendency within certain wings of the Conservative Party to maybe think, well, Rishi Sunak isn't doing it. Time is massively running out. Let's roll the dice. What have we got to lose?